say it right now. Okay, now we have almost 13 days, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So we have 13, 14 days left before your exam. Is this correct, right? So what we'll do is, Preet, can you switch off your video? So we will try to move really fast, right? And what we will be doing is that obviously we'll just be focusing on the past papers, but we'll discuss questions and I will be giving you more questions as homework to practice at home, and all the difficult ones that you have trouble doing on your own, then you can bring all those questions to the class so that we can speed up and do as many questions as much we can, right? Okay, now here's the first question, right? The first question, let me paste it in that thing and then we'll get started here, right? Okay, now the question here says 125, right? Okay, let's read it together. Now the question here says between 1995 and 2000 there was a chance in work patterns in Mauritius, right? Okay, fewer people worked in agriculture and fisheries as the country diversified away from its staple crop, sugar, and more worked in restaurants and hotels as the tourist industry increased. However, in 2000, the government stated that the economy still suffered from an inadequately trained workforce with lack of skills. How far can the economic theory of wages explain the implications of this situation for the wages of an agricultural laborer and a hotel manager, right? Okay, now this is the question for 25 marks. Right? So what is happening in this country, right? Between 1995 and 2000, between these 5 years, what happened? That fewer people were available to work in agriculture and fisheries as the country was diversifying, and more people started working in hotel industry because the tourist industry was booming. But the government said in 2000 that economy still lack skilled workforce, now trained or skilled workforce with lack of skills, right? Okay, how far can the economic theory of wages explain the implications of this situation for the wages of an agricultural laborer and a hotel manager, right? Right, it is about, Preet, it is about wage differential. It is about wage differential, but you also have to account for the statement that is being provided. Are you getting me? We will talk about wage differential. That's absolutely correct. We'll tell that why people in agriculture will earn less. What are the factors like demand, supply, and why people in hotel, why people in hotel, especially hotel managers, earn more, and the reasons and all that, right? But you also need to comment on what is happening in this case, right? Because overall, there is not much trained workforce. So how will that affect the wages of both agricultural workers and hotel managers? So we'll also comment on that as well. Demand for agricultural labor is low in comparison of the supply, and no or less qualification required for being agricultural labor. Exactly. So let's quickly first sum up the first part, right? So think about this. Just a second, right? So here's the answer, right? So I'm just giving you a guideline. Should start find for wage differential between agricultural workers and managers, right? Is this making sense? Okay. Now, what are the factors that are important over here? Being a manager requires higher qualifications and limited supply. And as hotel industry is growing in Mauritius, they will be paid higher. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. But one thing that you need to pay attention to, Preet, that for the demand part, when you're explaining the labor demand, now listen to this very carefully, right? Supply part is relatively simple, right? Supply of labor is determined by how many people are available to work in that occupation and what type of skills do they need. Like, is it difficult to become a hotel manager compared to becoming an agricultural worker, or vice versa, whatever, right? But for the demand part, make sure you explain marginal revenue product of labor. I repeat myself. For the demand part, you can't just say that demand is low or demand is high. I mean, you have to explain the reasoning behind it. And the reasoning is which occupation generates more revenue. So whichever occupation generates more revenue, that's the one for which there is more demand, and vice versa. Are you following me? Okay. Now for the demand for labor, expected to be low due to lower marginal revenue. Did you get this point? Labor compared to managers for their outputs. Okay, now think about this. If you think of basic basic agricultural products, right, their value is not that much, right? So if, let's say, agricultural workers are growing, let's say, they have in fact given some examples like, sugar, and so on and so forth, right, fisheries and so on, right? Now, raw fish, raw sugar will not have that much of value, right? So therefore the revenue that these workers will be generating for the companies or whoever landlord they are working for will not be very high, and therefore their marginal revenue product of labor will be less. When that is the case, therefore the demand for labor, demand for agricultural workers, right, will be low, and therefore their demand curve will lie to the left, right? This is making sense? Okay. uh since do give some supporting arguments. Since tourists um, spending power for luxurious um, uh, hotels to reside in, they um, what should be called, therefore managers make revenue, right? This is making sense. So this is how you explain it. Then moving to the supply part, I mean, I will not be repeating everything on its own, because as we just discussed at the start of the class, we'll be just quickly discussing what components should be written as the answer to a certain question, and then we'll move forward, right, just to save us ourselves some time, right? Now, moving on to the supply part, you absolutely correctly identified that supply of labor is based on the number of people who are available and willing to work in a certain occupation. Now, when you explain the supply part, you need to tell that what type of skills are needed for agricultural workers, and what type of skills are needed for hotel managers. Now, think about this. For agricultural workers, you don't need a degree, first of all, right? It's mainly manual work, right? Secondly, you also do not need some very special skills. So for instance, if you are cutting the crop, or if you're sowing seeds, or if you're spraying with insecticides and pesticides, right, it doesn't require any special skill. On the other hand, when you think of hotel managers, you do need a degree, you do need to be qualified enough to understand that what type of customers are coming to your hotel, what type of services they're looking for, how to serve them in the best possible manner, and how to expand your business, things like that, right? So this being said, obviously you rightly identified that hotel managers there will be lesser people available to work as hotel managers compared to workers, and therefore since supply is less for hotel managers and demand is more, since they generate more revenue, there will be wage differential, right? Right, exactly, right? So after you would have explained all these things, and also do remember, right? Let me write this down over here. Whenever there is a question related to wage differential, do mention the wage elasticity of supply and wage elasticity of labor demand. This is making sense, please? Wage elasticity. Is it simple? Any confusion so far? Anything? Yes, you should draw a graph. I mean, it's a very simple one. So you will draw the supply of hotel managers will be to the left, and the supply of agricultural workers will be to the right. And for the demand for hotel managers will be higher, and the demand for agricultural workers will be to the left, right? Is this making sense? And where the supply and demand for agriculture workers intersect, that will be the wage for agricultural workers, and where the supply and demand of hotel managers intersect, that will be the wage of hotel managers. As simple as that, right? The same parallel lines that we have seen a couple of times, right? But here's the main part. Preet, have a look at this, right? So whenever there's a question related to wage differential, demand and supply for labor is inelastic. Which labor you're talking about? That's the main question. So are you talking about hotel managers or are you talking about agricultural workers? Because that's the main part, right? Exactly. So the demand and supply of hotel managers, wage elasticity of demand and wage elasticity of supply of hotel managers is expected to be inelastic because of the fact that, first of all, if we talk about the supply, I mean, it's not that easy. Whenever wages are increasing, it's not that easy for anyone to become a hotel manager. You need to have some experience in the industry. You need to have a related degree, right? You need to have the skills that it requires. And so that those are the reasons. But for agricultural workers, since you do not need these skills and, you know, a specialized degree, nowadays we have, by the way, you might know that there are special degrees, I mean, qualifications and courses that train you to be a hotel manager. It is elastic. Yes, for agricultural workers, it will be elastic because low skills are needed and it's mainly manual work. So anyone can technically do that, right? And talking about the demand part, now think about this. It's easier. Now listen to this point very carefully. When we talk about the wage elasticity of labor demand, Preet, we we look at how easy it is to replace labor with some other factor of production. So if it's relatively easier to replace a certain type of labor with some other factor of production, then its demand will be more elastic or less elastic. Wage elasticity, if it's easier to replace a worker with another factor of production. So my question to you is, will it have more elastic demand or less elastic demand? That's the question. What do you think? Okay, yeah, let me repeat that. So think about this. So there's hotel managers and there's agricultural workers. Now, in both these occupations, if one of the occupations, it's easier to replace that labor with machines. Let me specify it more. If it's easier to replace a certain type of labor with machines, capital, technology, that's what I mean. So will that labor have a more elastic demand, wage elasticity of demand, or less? Agricultural workers is correct, but would they have more elastic demand or less elastic? High, exactly, more elastic demand. Absolutely, absolutely, excellent, right? That's correct. Why? Because think about this, the idea is fairly simple. So if you can replace that labor with technology or machines, then whenever the wages go up, what will, you know, landlords do? Whenever, you know, agricultural workers wages are going up, landlords would want to replace, you know, labor, manual labor with tractors, harvesters, like all the technology that you use on farm, right? Yes or no? Right? But that is not really the case with manager, hotel manager. Why? Because he or she is using her expertise, and, you know, they interact with people, so human interaction element is there, right? Are you getting? So whenever you are tourist, just imagine what type of services you require when you visit a hotel and what type of things you're looking for. So if you get good service, which would only be possible when there's a human interacting with you, right? So they will have low, hotel managers will have low wage elasticity of demand because it's not easier to replace them with machines or technology. And for agricultural workers, it will be high because it's easier to replace them with technology and machines, right? Easy, we got on this. Okay, after you have discussed all these things, now in the conclusion part, Preet, now in the conclusion part, think about this. You need to comment on the statement which is provided in the question. You need to comment on the statement which is provided in the question. So think about this. However, in 2000, so we do know that there are two parts to this statement. The first part says that economy is diversifying. It's moving away from primary sector and moving more towards tertiary sector, right? Because hotel management is basically a service which is tertiary. But at the same time, however, in 2000, the government stated that the economy still suffered from an inadequately trained workforce with the lack of skills. So there are not many people available in the economy who have adequate skills for different things. Could be for hotel managers, could be perhaps for agricultural workers as well. right? So, but since we know that training is more related in hotel managers case rather than, what is that called? Rather than agricultural work. So, I mean, that is the occupation that will be affected more. Are you getting me? Preet, right? So it is the hotel manager, a manager where you require more trained workforce, right? So therefore, it is that occupation that will suffer from less supply of labor, and therefore, as the result, what will that do? So let's put it down like this: since trained required in hotel industry, therefore, skilled workforce in Mauritius will affect hotel industry sector, right? For sector is physically fit and is willing to engage in work, which is not the case for the industry. This is making sense. Please, did you get this? Please keep the class short today as I would. Okay, no worries, no worries. Do let me know how much time we have. That's perfectly fine. We are done with this question, so we can quickly discuss one more question, right? 10-15 minutes, good. So 15 minutes would mean around 7. I'll end it. Okay, since trained labor force, right? This is making sense. So that is the last thing that you need to comment, right? So for these essay questions, quickly, Preet, always make sure that you do read the statement carefully, right? And you make up, you have some rough draft before you start, putting your answer down on the paper. You can do the rough work on the answer sheet. That's not a problem. You would know, right? And then you can just cancel it out so that the examiner doesn't read, right? You just don't need to make it illegible. Like, even if it's still readable, but there are lines on top of it, then that will mean that the examiner will not read it. He or she would know that it was your tough work. So that's perfectly fine. Does it make sense, right? But do make a roadmap before you start jumping onto the answer. And then this is how you conclude it, right? Good. Okay, now let's move to another question and see. So that was one. We did do this one, firefighters, and there was another thing, entertainment industry. Yeah. Right. Okay, did we do this question? I remember doing this question. Quickly have a look at it. Explain how economic theory of wage determination, explain the economic theory of wage determination in perfect competition. So if you remember, in this, we talked about that wages are determined on the basis of labor demand and labor supply. So how much is the total, do you want me to do this question? How much is the total demand for labor in the industry, right? Based on their marginal revenue product of labor, and how many people are available in the market to work in a certain occupation. So where the demand and supply of labor intersect, that is the market wage. That's the market wage, right? So that's how wages are determined in perfect competition. And then when the B part says, discuss whether this theory is useful in explaining how wages are determined in reality. Now, we do know that in reality, things are quite different. Yes or no? We do know that in reality, things are quite different. Why? Because there are trade unions, there's government intervention in terms of, minimum, what's that called? Minimum wages, right? And things like that. Yes or no? Right? And in some cases, there's monopsony. Monopsony is another thing that can exist in labor market, and so on and so forth. So in the B part, you have to discuss all these things. Okay. Okay. Okay, now this is an interesting question. Preet, let's quickly do this. Have a look at this. This is a completely, different type of question. So it will be nice if we do this. Okay, now let's read the question. Okay, explain whether there's a link between the marginal revenue product of labor and the wage rate in an occupation. Now think about this. This is a very good way to completely understand that what's the link between marginal revenue product of labor and the demand for labor, and therefore how does that affect the wage rate in a certain occupation. Okay, now the idea here is, think about this. First of all, you have to define marginal revenue product. Now, what is that? We do know that marginal means additional, revenue means how much money a company is getting from the sale of its goods, and labor is labor, right? So marginal revenue product of labor will be additional revenue that each unit of labor contributes to the business, right? Additional revenue that each unit of labor or each person, you can say, contributes to the company, right? Now that is what it is. Okay, now think about this. For all businesses, there is a certain marginal revenue product of labor. Now think about this. Let's take an industry. Let's take a specific example. So let's say we are talking about food industry, right? So we are talking about, or forget about food industry, we're talking about clothing industry, right? So like making t-shirts and making jeans and making whatever it is and so on and so forth, right? Now think about this. Now if we think of any particular business, right? Clothing, let's say Levi's, or whatever popular brand you know of, right? Okay, now for Levi's, they would know that how much revenue is each person generating, right? So if for Levi's, they would know how much revenue, marginal revenue product of labor, and on the x-axis you will have quantity of labor, right? So you will have quantity of labor, right? It's like how many people you are hiring. Quantity of, second, of labor, right? Okay, now if you do know, which you would remember, right, the concept of diminishing marginal utility, concept of diminishing marginal product of labor, we do know that each additional unit of labor contributes less to output, right? Each additional unit of labor contributes less to output, yes or no, right? So if I start identifying some points over here, right, so this is only for Levi's, right? I'll write it down so that you can remember, right? So Levi's is one brand within the clothing industry, and what Levi's knows about its workers is that how much each unit of labor is contributing to their revenue, right? Now, for the first guy, when they hired the first guy in their factory, right, how much worth of shirts, t-shirts, whatever, jeans, whatever it is producing, did this first guy produce for them, right? So let's say the first guy on his own, the first guy generated a revenue of $1,000 for the factory, right? Now the second guy, when they hired the second production worker, right, so that person generated a revenue of $800 for that factory, Levi's factory. Then when they hired the third guy, right, so that generated a revenue of, let's say, $600, and so on and so forth. Now this is only for one brand. Is this making sense, Preet? Right? Okay, so after you've defined what marginal revenue product of labor is, and you have made a graph for one firm, right, then you will say that obviously there is not only one firm in any industry. Industry is what? Industry is collection of firms that produce same product, right? So industry is what? Industry is collection of firms that produce same products. Yes or no? Okay. Now, this being said, think about it. If we add up the marginal revenue product of all the firms in the industry, if we add up the marginal revenue product of labor for all the firms in the industry, that would be what? That would be your demand, labor demand in the industry. That would be the total labor demand for the market or for the industry. Is this making sense? Then I don't know. Levi's is one popular clothing brand. Can you tell me name of another one? Denim. I don't know if this is the same or a different one, right? Could be denim, could be, Marks and Spencers, could be anything, right? Tommy Hilfiger, exactly, excellent, right? So then for the other company, you will do the same thing, right? Marginal revenue product of labor, and on the x-axis you will have quantity of labor, right? Then you will see another similar downward sloping curve, which is marginal revenue product of that firm only. Now, for denim, similarly, you will identify a few points that when they hire the first guy, second guy, third guy, fourth guy, fifth guy, how much revenue does each additional unit of labor contribute to their firm, right? Okay, now this being said, when you add up, let's assume there are only two firms, right? For the sake of simplicity, in this clothing industry in any country, right? So it's only the Levi's and the denim that produces clothing, right? Now, then you have to add up, these values, right? So you have to add up the values, right? So I'll tell you how that happens, right? So let's say for them, it's $1,200, right? So the first guy that denim hires, he or she generates a revenue of $1,200 for them. The second guy that they hire generates a revenue of something less, right? So let's say the second guy generates a revenue of $1,000. The third guy generates a revenue of, third guy generates, second, the third guy generates a revenue of 700 and so on and so forth, right? I'll just keep filling in the values. Okay, now think about this. Breathe. 400 and whatsoever. And let's say the last guy is generating a revenue of 300. Okay, now think about this. Breathe. Now, how do you find the market demand for labor from individual demand curves? Now, listen to this very carefully. How do we extract, how do we determine the market demand of labor from individual firms' demand curve? Now, for this graph on the left, it's only showing that if the wage rate is $1,000, how many units of labor would the company want to, how many units of labor would the company want to hire? Okay, so you're saying average product of labor. Average product of labor is what's the total product divided by the number of labor units. Okay. Now, before that, Preet, have a look at this. Let me clarify this point for you, right? Now, let me quickly show you. If you remember in AS economics, we talked about individual demand curve and market demand curve. Do you remember? So let's say if there are two consumers in a certain market, right, which is very highly unlikely, but I mean, just for the sake of example, if there are two consumers in the market and they are consuming, let's say, Coke or whatever, and so on and so forth, right? Now, about the higher the average product of labor is, the higher the demand and wage. The higher the average product labor is, the higher average product of labor. So that's what the average product of labor is, the higher the demand in the curve. I mean, let's keep it simple, Preet. So let's keep it simple. The higher the marginal product of labor is, the higher the marginal product of labor is, the higher would be its demand, right? Because the problem with average product of labor is that average product of labor does decrease after a certain point, given the fact that each individual is producing less. Each successive unit of labor makes less. So that's why beyond a certain point, the average product of labor starts to decrease. Initially, it goes up and then it starts to decrease, right? Okay, let's have a look at this. So right now, Preet, we're talking about that. How do you extract the market demand from individual demand curves, right? So let's say this is consumer A. Let's say this is consumer A and this is consumer B, right? Now, quickly have a look at this, right? So if we are talking about the market demand for a certain product, right? So let's say this is beef steak and there are, let's say, only two people in a town that like to consume beef steak, right? Now, if the price of the steak is, let's say, whatever, $300, $400, whatever it is, right? So at $300, let's say over here, how many units of steak would this guy want to consume in 1 week, let's say, right? So at the price of $400 or $300, right? $400, let's say this guy wants to consume 5 steaks in a month, right? And similarly, at the price of let's say this is 0.1, this is 0.2, right? At the price of something less than this, right? We do know that demand and price have inverse relationship, right? At the price of $200 per steak, this guy wants to consume 7 steaks per month. Easy. Preet, are you following me? Similarly, we will do the same for consumer B, right? That at a certain price level, right? At a certain price, $400, right? At price of $400, how many steaks would this guy want to consume? So let's say he wants to consume two, right? And at the price of $200, how many steaks does consumer B want to consume? Let's say he wants to consume four. So when we construct the market demand, what we do that at a certain price, we add up the total demand in the market. I repeat myself. Whenever we are constructing market demand, whether that be for a labor, whether that be for a product, so what we do that at a certain price or at a certain wage, because if it's labor demand, obviously that would be wage, not price. We add up the quantities. Preet, are you following me? Right? So when you draw the market demand for the product, so at $400, per steak, how much is the total demand in the market? Because obviously there are two consumers, so both of them will be consuming it. So A would want to buy how many units? 5. B would want to buy how many units? 2. So that makes a total of 7, right? So at the price of $400 per steak, now the total demand for steak in the market will be 7 units, like 7 steaks per month, right? And then similarly, we do it the same way for point 2, right? So at $200, consumer A wants to consume 7 steaks, and at $200 price, consumer B wants to consume 4. So that makes a total of 7 plus 4 is 11, right? So there will be total demand of 11 steaks in the market. Right? Easy. That's exactly what we do when we construct the labor demand curve. So at a wage of, because I did tell you that marginal revenue product of labor do equals wages. Why? Because think about this. If someone is generating, now think about Levi's, how you should remember this. So if the first guy at Levi's is generating a revenue of $1,000, do you think that the company would want to give him anything more than $1,000 at max? I mean, most probably it will be something less than that, right? But the maximum that you would want to pay to this person is $1,000. Yes or no? This is making sense, right? So what you do exactly, right? So what you do now when you construct the labor demand curve, so at $1,200, it will only be 1 unit of labor. Why? Because it's only Denim that wants to hire the first guy for $1,200. At $1,000 of wages, how much will be the total demand for labor? Preet, can you tell me? How much will be the total demand for labor in the market at $1,000? Right? So at $1,000, the total demand for labor in the market would be 3. Exactly. Because this guy wants to hire 2 people. This guy wants to hire 2 people. Denim. This guy, sorry, not guy. This company, Denim, wants to hire 2 units of labor. And, Levi's also wants to hire 1 person. So that makes a 2 plus 1, 3. Total demand for labor would be 3, right? Right. Yes. So let's stop here for today. I have this question mentioned in my, no worries. We can have a longer session tomorrow, right? So this is how you will explain the concept of, so we will continue from here. In fact, I have this question mentioned in front of me, right? So we'll continue from here tomorrow, right? Have a good night and best of luck for the accounting exam. Okay, bye. See you then.